all people are aware of class. To them, society is made up of the rich, the middle, and the poor.
The one thing that all three classes don't understand is that the pyramid continues upward. There is a detached hidden capstone made up of an elite board of directors who own and manage Illumicorp. The three classes below, in essence, become the assets and resources of Illumicorp. Illumicorp is divided into various administrative branches, but each branch has the same 5 levels in their hierarchy. You will begin at the bottom, in the initiate category. As such, your role will be to make sure that your orders are carried out through the sub-corporations and institutions controlled by Illumicorp.
You will be placed in plain sight, at the head of a company or institution in the public sector, to carry out the plans delivered from above. Remember, your role is very important. You will be the face of Illumicorp to the outside world. You are our connection to the masses below. Never speak publicly about your orders or your masters. Now let's look at Illumicorp's 6 administrative branches and their functions. You will be placed in a top position of power among one of the following sectors. In this way, as you are monitored and guided from above, you will decide strategy and introduce programs that further our goals. But that is the secret to Illumicorp's success. Control the head, and you control the body. This is potentially Illumicorp's most effective instrument for global control. Through international banking, we manipulate the fate of all countries. We have introduced many institutions, such as the IMF and WTO, that work in our favor to impoverish disobedient nations. Always remember, debt is a powerful weapon against countries that don't share Illumicorp's vision.
Perhaps our greatest achievement in banking is the Federal Reserve System. It is a collection of international banks owned by Illumicorp members and financiers. It was created to form a centralized banking system through the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, an act that was indeed penned by some of our most esteemed members. Many of you might still assume that the government itself prints and issues the currency. That is not the case. When America needs money, they go to our boys and ask for it. The money is printed, but it is only representative of a loan. Interest accrues on that dollar until it is paid back to the Fed. In fact, the federal taxes paid by the American population go almost entirely to paying off this debt. So you see, Illumicorp derives a healthy amount of its operation funding directly from the debt of the public. Needless to say, this is one of our most crucial sources of funding and one of our proudest achievements here at Illumicorp. Through mergers and acquisitions, we have slowly and silently bought up the majority of U.S. industry. Illumicorp and its members own most of the oil, transport, banking, media, food and communications industries in America and abroad. Through fewer and fewer conglomerates, we are able to effect with great precision the machinations of labor and government.
So what is a central bank? A central bank is an institution that issues and regulates the currency of an entire nation. Based on historical precedent, the typical powers inherent in central banking practice include the control of interest rates and the expansion and contraction of the money supply itself. Now, the central bank does not simply issue money to the government, it loans it to them with interest. Then, through the mechanisms of increasing and decreasing the supply of money, the central bank essentially regulates the value of the currency issued. It is critical to understand that the entire structure of this system can only produce one thing in the long run: debt. It doesn't take a lot of ingenuity to figure this scam out, for nearly every single dollar produced by both the central bank and its regulated commercial banks is loaned at interest. That means every dollar produced is actually the dollar plus a certain percentage of debt based on that dollar. And since the banking system has the monopoly of the production of the currency, and they loan each dollar out with an immediate debt attached to it, where does the money to pay for the debt come from? It can only come from the banks again, which means the banking system has to perpetually increase its money supply to temporarily cover the outstanding debt created, which in turn, since that new money is loaned out at interest as well, creates even more debt. The end result of this system is essentially slavery, for it is technically impossible for a government, and thus the public, to ever come out of the self-generating debt. By the early 20th century, the U.S. had already implemented and removed a few central banking systems, which were maneuvered into place by ruthless banking interests. At this time, the dominant families in the banking and business world were the Rockefellers, the Morgans, the Warburgs, the Rothschilds. And in the early 1900s, they sought to push, once again, legislation to create another central bank. However, they knew the government and public were very weary of such an institution, so they needed to create an incident to affect public opinion. So, J.P. Morgan, publicly considered a financial luminary at the time, exploited his mass influence by reportedly creating rumors that prominent banks in New York were insolvent or bankrupt. Morgan knew this would trigger mass hysteria and a systemic crisis. And it did. The public, in fear of losing their deposits, immediately began mass withdrawals. Consequently, the banks were forced to call in their loans, causing the recipients to sell their property, and thus a spiral of bankruptcies, repossessions, and turmoil emerged. Putting the pieces together years later, Congressman Charles Lindbergh wrote, "The King bankers put in motion in 1907 a great scheme. They had gambled and speculated on Wall Street until so many watered stocks and bonds had been manufactured. The King bankers knew the condition and informed the favored of their friends what was to come. There was to be a panic in the fall of 1907 that would be advertised as the result of our bad banking and currency laws." The panic of 1907 led to a congressional investigation headed by Senator Nelson Aldrich, who had intimate ties to the financial powers and later became part of the Rockefeller family through marriage. The commission led by Aldrich recommended a central bank should be implemented so a panic like 1907 could never happen again. This was the spark that the bankers needed to initiate their plan, and in 1910 a secret meeting was held at a J.P. Morgan estate on Jekyll Island off the coast of Georgia. It was there that the central banking bill called the Federal Reserve Act was written. This legislation was written by bankers, not lawmakers. This meeting was so secretive, so concealed from government and public knowledge, that most of the figures who attended disguised their names when en route to the island. After this bill was constructed, it was then handed over to their political frontman, Senator Nelson Aldrich, to push through Congress. And in 1913, with heavy political sponsorship by the bankers, Woodrow Wilson became president, having already agreed to sign the Federal Reserve Act in exchange for campaign support. And a few days before Christmas, when much of Congress was at home with their families, the Federal Reserve Act was voted in, and Wilson in turn made it law. The night before its passage, Congressman Charles Lindbergh pleaded, "This act establishes the most gigantic trust on earth. When the president signs this act, the invisible government by the money power will be legalized." Mr. Chairman, we have in this country one of the most corrupt institutions the world has ever known. I refer to the Federal Reserve Board and the Federal Reserve Banks. This evil institution has impoverished and ruined the people of the United States and has practically bankrupted our government. It has done this through the defects of the law under which it operates, through the maladministration of that law by the Federal Reserve Board and through the corrupt practices of the moneyed vultures who control it. It is important to clearly understand the Federal Reserve is a private corporation. It is about as federal as Federal Express. It makes its own policies and is under little regulation by the U.S. government. It is a private bank that loans all the currency at interest to the government, completely consistent with the central banking model that the country sought to escape from when it declared independence in the American Revolutionary War.